Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Paul Rowe, and I am the head of medical for Sanofi. I'm very pleased to welcome you to what should be a very, very vibrant discussion today. What's next for Boston's life sciences sector? I'm currently leading a North America team at Sanofi, which is a biopharma company of around 90,000 employees in over 100 countries. And I have to say, that despite my former global role, Massachusetts is very central to what we always do. And it's actually an important part of the global life sciences ecosystem. And what happens around the Commonwealth really has an echo around the world. As a physician, I really understand what a strong life sciences sector means for patients, families, and the practice of medicine. And at Sanofi, we chase the miracles of science to improve the lives of patients. We also know how important it is to support that next generation of scientists, the next generation of physicians, and really supporting the overall ecosystem to ensure that we're getting the most out of innovation and that we're working together to truly advance the science forward. Today's panel includes organizations that we enthusiastically support. So I look forward to hearing from these leaders about what's next in medical innovation, talent development, allied industries, and policy landscape. So thank you. I hope you enjoy today's discussion. I will now hand over to the moderator for today, Robert Weissman, a life science reporter for the Boston Globe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rowe. Welcome. Good afternoon. Welcome to day 2 of the Boston Globe Health and Biotech Week 2024. I'm Rob Weissman, a biotech reporter for the Globe. And today we're going to talk about what's next for the Boston area life sciences industry. This is a good day to have this conversation because Governor Healey this morning in her speech to the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce confirmed that she plans to extend the state's life sciences initiative, first launched by former Governor Deval Patrick, for another 10 years. Her proposal, which will be detailed in the economic development bill that will be filed later this week, should also include some incentives to take the industry into some interesting new directions. So this afternoon, we're going to talk about the state of the industry. We're going to take some of the questions that were submitted from readers, and we're going to take some questions live as well. We have a great panel to discuss all of this. I'm joined by Kendall Berlin O'Connell, the President and Chief Executive of the Massachusetts Biotechnology Council, by Gretchen Cook Anderson, the Executive Director of Lab Central's Ignite program, and by Jeffrey Myers, the Boston Research Director for commercial real estate firm Colliers. Welcome to everybody. We will take some questions at the end from the audience, but let's get started right now. Kendall, in the past year, we've seen new drugs for Alzheimer's and sickle cell disease emerging from the Massachusetts cluster here. We've also seen falling venture capital investments and vacant lab space across the region. How do you explain this seeming disconnect between advancing science and the challenges in the economic conditions?
Thank you, Rob, for having me. Great question, and thrilled to be having this conversation with my friends Gretchen and Jeff today. And so I guess let's start, right? 2023 was a year with a lot of sort of apprehension, right? There were some market changes that we were seeing, and there was a lot of sentiment that investment had been drying up. We had a really tight IPO market. We know that. But all in all, and maybe I'm an eternal optimist, but we're in the best place in the world for life sciences. And 2023 was actually a pretty good year when it came to FDA approvals and the role that Massachusetts plays for patients. We saw, 38 approvals from 25 companies that have a presence here in Massachusetts last year, right? So, and what happened for the sickle cell community was maybe the greatest story of the year, right? A patient community of about 8 million people who had no treatment, and our homegrown companies, Vertex and CRISPR, had a therapy for a community that had been waiting. This is what we do here in Massachusetts. You know, when you think of funding that happened last year, $7.7 billion of venture capital investment came to Massachusetts headquartered companies, about 221 rounds, right? And that number certainly wasn't as good as we saw in 2020, 2021, those real peak years. But overall, that was a good number, right? That's the fourth largest funding year on record. So what we saw was more cautious investment happening, smaller rounds over a longer time horizon, but good science was continuing to get funded. And in Massachusetts, that's what we do here. That's our hallmark, right? And when there's a market reset, we've seen this. We're a mature ecosystem. So we're typically the last to enter that sort of volatility and the first to exit. And we're seeing that now. We had a great end of 2023, some good M&A activity happening. I was at JP Morgan. We left cautiously optimistic for good things to come. And you know, what you talked about as it relates to vacancy, listen, I think this is a positive. And maybe my friend Jeff will, you know, have a different perspective on this. But for so long, we had no space available in Cambridge and in Boston, right? Companies that wanted to break into this market couldn't find a location to move into, or companies that were here and were ready to grow and scale had no place to move into. So what they were doing, if they were fortunate enough to find space, they were taking on too much space, right? We want companies to spend that investment smart. We want it to be on science. And so now with some availability of space and what we're seeing from a regionalization perspective, right? We're seeing emerging clusters all around the Commonwealth, not just in Cambridge, not just in Boston. This offers more opportunity for companies that couldn't break into our market. Now's the time. For companies that are located here who are ready to grow and scale, they can stay here because they can find space that's appropriate for their needs at that moment and know when they're ready to grow, there will be space available. I also think it's a really great opportunity for us to recruit more of those big pharma companies to have a physical presence here, right? We have 18 of the top 20 biopharma with a physical presence here. The governor said it this morning, something to be really proud of. Let's get more. Let's get all 20. Now's our time.
That's great. Well, I think Jeff knows a little bit about the lab space and some of the dynamics behind it. Jeff, Colliers publishes the Life Sciences Market Reports. And in your fourth quarter report, you showed that Boston vacancy rate of almost 17% in the metro area, the highest in more than 15 years. Did the industry overbuild? And how does all this empty lab and office space get absorbed?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Robert, thank you for having me out here today. And Kendall, I actually share your optimism in the market. That 17% vacancy rate, yeah, that's pretty high. But let's put that in perspective and put some numbers on that. Let's rewind 2 years ago. We had about a 1% vacancy rate. And at that point in time, there was about 500,000 square feet across the entire market that was available. So for some of that story Kendall was just speaking about, yeah, if you're a tenant in that market, there is no opportunity. Today, there's a lot. That 17% vacancy rate translates into about 8 million square feet of empty space that's either never been occupied in brand new buildings or is in buildings that have been built for a while, or it's just sublease space. So to answer the question, have we overbuilt? I don't know if we've really overbuilt. I think I'm gonna use a friendlier term for developers and say maybe some of those projects have mistimed the market a little bit, because over the past several years, we have seen a lot of absorption in new product. Millions and millions of square feet of new product last year got absorbed. Granted, some of that still sits vacant today, but there was a release of pent-up demand because of that new space. Now, unfortunately for some landlords, across the market, we're tracking more than 10 million square feet that's still under construction today. And the majority of that space is not leased. So vacancies at about 17% today. In 2024 and into 2025, we're probably going to see that vacancy rate get even higher. But looking back over the past several quarters, it really hasn't been as much of a demand issue as a supply side issue that's been causing vacancies to rise. In a typical quarter, absorption has been positive. And over the long haul, given what Dr. Rose said and what Kendall said, I agree. The Boston market is the place to be for the life sciences sector. If you look at the per capita spending on pharmaceuticals, well, in the United States in general, it's amongst the highest in the world. About 2% of our GDP goes into pharmaceuticals. And most of the known diseases out there, it's only about 5% of them or so that have US FDA approved procedures in place. Given all of that demand and time, I think that the space will fill. However, in the near term, with some of that space that's underway, you will have some of those nodes that are emerging with lots of construction, like let's say Somerville, which had no purpose-built life science space at one point and is now going to have millions of square feet. It's going to take a while for some of that space to get absorbed in the market.
Great. Well, I want to drill into those satellite clusters a little bit later on. But Gretchen, biotech has long been an industry of highly educated, mostly white researchers and scientists clustered in and around Cambridge. But there are efforts underway to diversify the employee and talent base. Can you talk about what Lab Central is doing toward that end and how it fits into the industry's broader efforts? And maybe also share a little bit about the role Lab Central plays in the local industry.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Rob, for having me. And again, it's great to be on board for this panel with both Jeff and Kendall. So I want to also kind of jump on the optimism train as well. I think what we saw last year, despite the market, was folks were still being employed in the sector. They were still, they were still training, they were still getting themselves educated and prepared for the market, and they were still getting really high quality jobs. So that I do want to kind of start there. But from the perspective of diversity and diversifying the sector in general, I think we all probably agree that innovation really thrives when everyone is at the table, when everyone has an opportunity to contribute at every level within an organization, and at every level of education. And so I think I want to really emphasize that. So the work at Lab Central Ignite, we're a first of its kind. There are lots of organizations now who are, really diversifying and figuring out really amazing and innovative ways to diversify this industry. But we started off about 3 years ago. We celebrated our 3-year anniversary back in January. It's sort of a first of its kind platform in the sector that was dedicated 100% every day with a full-time staff team to diversifying the sector, to really addressing systemic, racial, gender, and other underrepresentation in the sector, both across talent at the early career phase, all the way up through folks who are PhDs and scientists, and folks who are sitting on boards. We really want to make sure our boards are diversified, that our streams of funding, that the folks are making decisions about that funding, that there's diversification there, and that our entrepreneurs, that we're really supporting our entrepreneurs of color and our women entrepreneurs. And so Lab Central's role here, both, I want to kind of skip back for just a moment to the mention of lab space, because we are welcoming folks. We really, we're a place where for the last 10 years, and we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary later this year, but for the last 10 years have equitably supported early stage startups in the life sciences. And we continue to do that. We have space available here, as well as space all over the city, Cambridge and all over Boston, so in the Boston area. So I do want to mention, because, come on, folks, we've got space for you right here at Lab Central. Got to put that plug in. But what we're doing at Lab Central Ignite, we're really trying to coalesce with other organizations in the ecosystem to collaborate with Bioversity and Mass BioEd and JVS and Just a Start and lots of other wonderful, amazing organizations that are all pulling together in a collective action effort, much of which is being supported by Mayor Wu and her administration in Boston, which is very exciting. We together just in Boston, so, and this expands even beyond the city, but just in Boston, we are working to quickly, with very good intention, expand the number of Black, Brown, and other residents who are underrepresented in the life sciences by over 1,000 employees. That is what we're looking to do in 2024, 2025, and beyond, but we're really centered on this work this year. We are also collaborating with our higher ed institutions, both in Boston and all over the state, out in Worcester and Western Mass, up in Lowell at UMass Lowell and UMass Boston. We are working collaboratively, both Lab Central Ignite and our partners, to make this work happen. We know that, again, the more folks we have at the table who are contributing their brain, all that amazing brain power at every aspect of a vertical of an organization, that's what's going to continue to drive diversity and innovation in this space and continue to keep us on top here in Massachusetts.
Great. And just to follow up, Gretchen, you mentioned the efforts to move to broaden the industry geographically into other parts of the state. And also you mentioned Bioversity and Mass Bioed workforce training programs. A lot of that's geared toward biomanufacturing, which would be an expansion beyond research and development. What kinds of successes are you seeing in those areas? And
Yeah.
how are they likely to evolve in the coming years?
Absolutely. I think this is a great new space for the state to really focus on, is really centering manufacturing here, not just research and development, but our manufacturing. We want our pharma manufacturers right here in the state. And so we're all working on this. So we have both a Career Forge program at Lab Central Ignite that is upskilling folks who are pharmacy techs and who have adjacent skill sets with just 120 hours of learning. So that's on the R&D side. We have an emerging biomanufacturing curriculum that will also be launching later this year. And then again, our folks at Mass Bioed and other organizations are really centered on biomanufacturing. We know that this is it's a really great horizon for us to pioneer here in the state, and we want the companies to stay right here in Massachusetts and manufacture their drugs and medications and therapies. So, but yes, we're partnering. I think you'll see a lot of partnerships, expanding partnerships with places like WPI out in Worcester and other institutions, Amherst College, UMass Amherst. There's a lot of partnership that's going on, and we're starting to really see the fruits of all of that labor.
Great. And Jeff, one of the points that your report raised and that you cited is that the current market favors tenants more than the building owners or developers maybe at this point. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what this means for the established drug makers, the startups that are looking for more or new space. How is it affecting the pricing, the leasing patterns? Is it allowing companies to launch or expand with less capital maybe than they did in the past?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a much more favorable environment for tenants now than it was 2 years ago. There's simply more competition in the market for those tenants. And as soon as that happens, if you're a tenant, all of a sudden you're in a much more favorable position when it comes time to negotiate a lease. Whereas when there's 500,000 square feet of space available and it's all in older buildings and you want space, well, you're really much at the landlord's whim. And at that point, you're signing deals for a lot of space because you're leasing defensively and you may be getting space you don't need yet. Or perhaps you're taking on space that you're going to have for a 10-year term or longer because that's what's required to get into some of these new properties. However, if you're a smaller company, you're smart up and you're not really sure where you're going to be in 10 years, today's market is much more favorable. Because in addition to those long-term direct options, you have millions of square feet of sublease space as well. So if you're a tenant, you can go into some of the sublease space that may already be built out. So you're not even worried about the same amount of upfront tenant improvement exposure from a cost perspective to get into that space. And then when we were tight with 1% of vacant space in the market, rents were fast rising. They grew really, really rapidly. But now landlords are being challenged when it comes to actually pushing rental rates because of all that competition to get occupancy in their buildings, which means that there's a more breathing room for tenants in the market to take a little bit more time to see where they want to be, to find the space that fits them best, both in terms of scale, in terms of timing in the market and things like that. And there's some other things that are moving in tenants' favors as well. If you look at the public markets, for instance, the S&P Biotech ticker XBI, well, that's up about 50% from the bottom of where it was back in 2023. And it's actually pretty much in line with where it was at the pre-COVID mark, which means that the public markets may be starting to thaw a little bit. Companies may be starting to feel like, hey, our runway is going to be a little bit better now if the financing is there. Interest rates aren't going up like they were before, so they're able to make business investments. And all of those things put them in a better position to be out in the market leasing space than it did throughout a good chunk of the past several quarters.
Got it. Kendall, the Biden administration last year announced that Cambridge will be one of the national hubs for ARPA-H, which is these moonshot programs, initiatives for healthcare. And of course, the First Lady, Jill Biden, was in town last week talking about one of those initiatives. How is the mass biotech industry responding to this? And what kinds of breakthroughs do you see coming out of ARPA-H that the life sciences industry here in Massachusetts isn't already working on?
Yeah, Rob, this was a huge win for the administration, Team Massachusetts, and all of us that are part of this ecosystem, right? To be named the Investor Catalyst Hub for ARPA-H. We knew it should be Massachusetts. And it's, sort of the story I tell all the time about why Massachusetts is the best place in the world for life sciences kind of being validated. As Gretchen mentioned, when we're talking about workforce, we collaborate better than any place in the world. I truly believe that. And we've seen that time and time again. That's what led us to be where we are from life sciences, right? We got there through this incredible partnership between industry, government, academia, our hospital systems, right? And we saw that on full display again. This was a highly competitive process to get ARPA-H here, right? Everyone, all of these stakeholders sort of put their ego aside. We got together for the good of Massachusetts, but in the good of patients, right? So when you're thinking about why Massachusetts, well, and we saw this on display during COVID, right? What do we do so well here, right? We collaborate, and when there's concentrated resource, both financial and time resource, things can move faster here than any place else in the world, right? So take that and apply that to creating innovation for huge patient populations and communities that have for far too long been left out or underrepresented. So to have the First Lady here in Cambridge last week announce $100 million investment in women's health is incredible. And what better place than Massachusetts to do this? MassBio held our first women's health event last year, and it was incredible to think about the disparities that exist in women's health. And let me just give you a few stats on this. Do you know that in clinical trials, about 75% of participants are men? Well, women respond differently. But when therapies and drugs are built towards men, we're at a disadvantage, right? And when you think about investment in 2020, just 4% of all biopharma R&D investment went to female-specific cancers. When you think of Massachusetts, oncology is our #1 research space. And just 1% went towards all other female-centric conditions. That's $2 billion of almost $2 billion going to women-focused areas. So to have ARPA-H come here to Massachusetts and announce this type of investment for women, this is a huge win. And when we think about health equity, we're going to move the needle here in Massachusetts, and everyone's going to be watching. And this type of investment and having the Investor Catalyst Hub is what's going to do that. And when you think about the research that's happening here, right, I talked about FDA approvals that happened in 2023. Well, we've already had 6 drugs file for an FDA application this year, right? And there are 38 phase 3 clinical trials happening in Massachusetts. And when you think about the patient populations that are going to be impacted, Vertex is working on something around acute pain right now. Schizophrenia hasn't had a new therapy in decades, and we're looking for an FDA approval this year from a homegrown Massachusetts company, Karuna. Oncology, I mentioned that earlier. Hopefully we'll get an approval for something for the leukemia community this year, again, from a Massachusetts company, Syndex. So there's just so much exciting innovation that's happening here. And I think that having ARPA-H and the Investor Catalyst Hub is another way to get that funding into this research and accelerate getting solutions to patients.
Got it. And in the realm of diversity, Gretchen, some of the issues that Kendall cited sort of extend beyond the workforce. One is clinical trials. We've historically seen drug makers recruit patient cohorts that are primarily white and male. Is this starting to change, and why is it important to include more women and patients of color in these clinical trials?
Well, to piggyback on and thank you, Rob, for this is an important question. Thank you for that. And then I want to piggyback on what Kendall was just talking about when it comes to women. The same is true for populations of color. There are environmental factors that that make a difference. There are, all kinds of reasons as to why clinical trials must be diverse. The patient base must be diverse. I got some information from a good friend, Reginald Swift, who is the CEO of a wonderful startup in this space called Rubik's Life Sciences. And he is working diligently every day and happens to be a man of color, African-American man and CEO in this space. But he had, just sort of updated me a little bit on where we are when it comes to diversity in clinical trials here in the state. So according to some data that he has, and this is all the work that his company does is all around diversity in clinical trials and accessing diversity among patients. I think there's scheduled to be something like 257 clinical trials here in Massachusetts in 2024, where only 82% of those clinical trials are not being held in spaces where there is a high population of folks of diverse background, diverse racial backgrounds, for example. And so, that's something where we still have work to be done. And it's not just, that's not just Massachusetts, that is everywhere. And I think if anything, we're leading in Massachusetts when it comes to trying to make a difference. When it comes to the attention around health equity, conversation, and real work that's being done around health equity. In fact, even here at Lab Central, we have an event that'll be hosted on Thursday around this very thing when it comes to rare disease. And so we're all collectively, again, working on these issues. It's extremely important that we get this right for the sake of patients everywhere and of all backgrounds.
Good. When we look at geographic expansion, Jeff, we've seen smaller or satellite biotech clusters emerging in the Seaport, in Boston's Fenway neighborhood, in suburbs like Watertown and Somerville. What are the considerations that that companies make when they decide to move to one of those clusters as opposed to the traditional hub in Kendall Square in Cambridge?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Kendall Square, Cambridge, East Cambridge has definitely been the hub of the life sciences industry for a long time. And it still is the big gorilla when it comes to the companies that are there, the types of companies that are there, the size of buildings and the inventory and the leasing that takes place is still really dominant. However, the industry is now spreading across the Bay State. It's not just the Kendall Square thing anymore. I would argue that the Seaport isn't even up and coming. It's there now. There's a lot of big businesses there. It's there. There's big developments, big companies, foundations that are doing great research over there. The Fenway market, if you look at the NIH funding that goes into that geography right there, that single geography, not the whole Boston market, but that geography gets more NIH funding than 44 individual states. So there's a lot of activity happening over there. But now we're at a point where the market got so tight and there's so much demand in the marketplace, the when tenants are looking at where they want to go, yeah, they need space, they need a building, but they also need exposure to highly qualified workforce. They need access to transportation. They need access to where their venture capital is. They need access to hospitals. They need access to a lot of different things in the workforce that are present. And if you're talking about the GMP, well, that changes that equation there and again. So what we've seen is that the landscape is spreading. Watertown, Somerville, 128 are getting activity now that they never had before. Go further out to Devens and 495 and you're getting conversions. Go up to North Andover, you're getting activity out there. This is not just a Cambridge and East Cambridge event anymore. This has truly become a Bay State project where we're contributing and bringing up the entire state at the same time.
Thank you. Well, before we start taking some of the questions, I wanted to just ask one last thing, and I'm hoping each of you can address it briefly. And that's the sense of that the perception of the industry is changing. Biotechs were sort of the heroes of the pandemic, rushing out these life-saving vaccines. But more recently, it seems like it's gone back to biotechs sort of being the bad guys in the debate over high drug prices. How fair is that criticism, and how are you trying to counter it? And maybe Kendall, you could start quickly, and maybe Jeff and Gretchen could chime in if you'd like, but.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I'm always so frustrated by the lack of understanding about what this industry means for the lives of patients around the world. You know, we call our annual meeting the state of possible because I truly believe that in Massachusetts, we turn impossibilities into possibilities for patients. And what people sometimes forget is this is a really tough industry to succeed in. 90% of companies fail. It takes about 10 to 15 years and about $1 billion to $2.5 billion to bring a drug to market. And let me repeat what I said, 90% of companies fail. So we've heard a lot this past year, right, about companies laying off and closures because it's hard to get funding. It's hard to get a successful drug to the market. That being said, and Gretchen mentioned this, although we were seeing layoffs, we did and continue to hire too. In the first half of the 2023, we added about 3,000 jobs. We'll have that data soon on what the second half of the year looked like. But it is frustrating, but we haven't done a good job of telling a story. And I know that, and I tell the team here at MassBio, we are on a storytelling journey to make sure everybody, and part of that is workforce, every resident in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, every person within this country should be able to see themselves in a life science career. And so it's people like Gretchen and our friends at MassBioEd and Bioversity that we're creating these on-ramps. And for the first time in a long time, we're going into the community and telling a better story, right? And so we need to do that as it relates to the impact we have in patients. By the way, we punch way above our weight class here in Massachusetts. We represent about 15% of the national drug development pipeline and 7% of the global drug development pipeline. This is life-changing stuff. And again, I'll go back to the sickle cell community, right? That was a huge victory for a community that had no other options. And even when you win, sometimes you fail in this industry. And think about what happened for the postpartum community and Sage and Biogen. Huge win. The first therapy for postpartum depression for this patient population, right? But because they didn't get a broader indication, right, with that approval, their stock dropped by 50% and they had to do layoffs, right? So even when there's a victory, it's still a challenge. So I do think we have a lot of work to do to tell a better story, but yeah, it's frustrating because we are changing the lives of patients who have no other hope. And Massachusetts is the place where we're really doing that novel breakthrough research and development.
You guys do Gretchen or Jeff want to add
Yeah,
anything?
I would love to. And I'm so happy that Kendall brought up the storytelling element because, you know, I think that the industry itself hasn't been telling its own good story well enough, right? We do, but we're not, I think we need to do even more. And so, you know, along with a number of organizations within the ecosystem, back in fall of 2022, Lab Central Ignite kind of helped to lead the way in launching the Life Sciences in Full Color public awareness campaign because we understood that biotech was really just a buzzword to the average person on the street. Who was not necessarily directly connected to the industry, and especially in historically disconnected communities where we really want to tell the story about biotech. We want to help them understand, people all over the state, to understand the relevance of the life sciences to their everyday lives. I think that, you know, if we can tell that story, that can help change some of that perception around cost. I think people will understand what goes into innovation in the first place, and therefore some of the costs that are therefore incurred. But I think it's also depends on the perspective from which you're coming. So if you're Michelle, who went through our Career Forge program, for example, as a young pharmacy tech, a single mom with a son who moved to Massachusetts when she was quite young, from another country, by the way. If you're coming at this from her perspective, the life sciences is an amazing sector because she got trained in the sector, upskilled. She landed an amazing new job with career mobility and is making $40,000 a year more than she was making before she started. And so it is also changing lives from that perspective. So we are not only changing lives through science, we are changing lives through training and upskilling and education, and that storytelling element. Helping people see themselves in the sector is so important.
Great. Well, I want to move to, I'm sorry to cut you off, Jeff. I want to move to some of the questions that maybe you could jump in on this first one. These are questions submitted by our readers. John Curry asks, how will the low rate of capital formation in life sciences affect growth in the next few years? And I don't know, I mean, obviously it's been tougher for companies to get funding. How do you see that affecting the growth in the real estate space?
Yeah, obviously, the easier it is to finance projects and finance growth and research, the better it is for the real estate markets. And the rise in interest rates put downward pressure on company values. The rise in interest rates put downward pressure on business investment, really not just for the life science industry, but for businesses across the economic spectrum. So with the Fed now having stabilized rates over the past few months and projecting they're going to start lowering rates sometime in 2024, I think that will be helpful to start kickstarting some of that investment that had been sitting on the sidelines. So I think there is some near-term upside there, but we'll have to see how that plays out. But I think when we're talking about this, it's also a matter of understanding that what's happening at the federal level, the state level, and the local level all really do matter. Policy matters. We've talked about the pricing of drugs and what's happening at the national level, or what the governor said this morning around the state initiatives to fund the industry. But local zoning matters as well. For economic development, are you going into a community that's in front of it where the zoning is allowed and the buildings can go in by right? So it's easier to get these buildings built and help control costs on that side. Or are you in a community where people don't want to be next to that because they're concerned that somehow there's some bugs that are going to come off the building and get them sick, even though it's a BSL-1 research institution, which means that the biosafety level hazard is not really, it's negligible. So public perceptions and those things matter as well. But I think as far as business growth, there's upside in the near term that we didn't have over the past few quarters.
Right. And you mentioned drug prices. Another important question. Dominic Tong asks, what is being done to reduce the cost of healthcare? And maybe as part of that same related question from Beatrice Brunkhorst, how can cancer care be made more affordable? I don't know who wants to handle that one, but Kendall, do you want to?
Well, I'll take a stab at this to start. So sort of back to what I said, right? Bringing a therapy to a patient is incredibly expensive and it takes a really long time. And by the way, the price that a patient pays, it is a highly complex landscape. There are a lot of players in this. And so drug pricing from the manufacturer is just one component of this, right? And for the first time in as long as I can remember, there's now active conversation about some of the other players around PBMs and what goes into PBMs. And this is not a regulated space, right? And they play a huge role in dictating the price that patients pay at the pharmacy counter. And people, it's complex, it's hard to understand, right? And so all of this has to be taken into account. And finally, at a state and federal level, there's conversations around PBMs, but there's still no action happening. And the other thing I just want to mention as part of this, drug pricing is one part of this conversation, but Jeff mentioned it. The regulatory landscape is so important, right? We are fortunate to have the most innovative place in the world here in Massachusetts, not just because it's an economic engine for the Commonwealth, but because of the impact it has on patients. I told you, we represent a huge portion of that drug development pipeline. But when you think about what's happening at a federal level, think about this, right? We've got FTC coming in and stopping mergers and acquisitions. That's a really important part of our life cycle. We've got the administration thinking about exercising margin on buy-dole. This has been around since 1981, and it's an imperative for public-private partnership, right? This is, how do you think the COVID vaccine happened? Most research starts with some type of government funding, right? And then you think about the IRA and what the impacts of this are around the exclusivity, the 9 to 13 years piece, and the health equity piece, right? You can't continue to create all of these barriers from a regulatory perspective and think that people will still want to innovate here, not just in Massachusetts, but in the United States. So there's a lot of headwinds we're facing.
Right. And when you mention the PBMs, you're talking about these intermediaries, pharmacy benefit managers that determine what drugs are offered in the formularies at pharmacies.
Exactly.
So We've got some questions from live questions from some of the folks who are listening. Not sure, we're also running out of time, so let me just see if we can get to one or two of them quickly. This is a good one. With the cost of living being comparatively high in Massachusetts, how will that continue to lead with increasing competition from other states like North Carolina, for example? And Jeff, I don't know if you want to jump in on that one.
Yeah, I think this is probably something we would all have commentary on, but we've always been kind of a high cost of living state. And in some ways, it does hold us back because if you want to get a little bit of sunshine in your life and do so affordably, Massachusetts is probably not the best place for you. But that innovation is here for a reason. We have 250,000 college students, and high percentages of them are coming from local institutions that are highly rated. We have more clinical trials and strong hospital networks. Our educational attainment is second only to the Bay Area. So there's a reason that research and all of that high value add economic activity takes place here. And maybe there's some things we can do to make the living more affordable. And that gets into other areas of policy around housing construction and those things. So there is risk there, but it's probably not very easy to replace that intelligent workforce that's here and simply go to other places that don't have that.
Mhm.
Great. And I think this would be a good one for Gretchen. In
Sure.
light of the current economic state of the life sciences industry in Massachusetts, what do you believe are contributing factors that facilitate progress, and what obstacles hinder the removal of credentials barriers for individuals without a bachelor's degree?
So what you said, what obstacles?
What obstacles? It sounds like he or she is asking, how can people without a bachelor's degree get into the industry?
Okay, that's again another good question. This is a space where we're working, Bioversity and several others are working in this space. So, we need, really highly trained lab-based professionals, folks in biomanufacturing. And many of these jobs actually do not require a college degree. May require, a bit of a certificate or kind of proof of training, and maybe a review of curriculum for some employers, because we have had that. But what we're finding is that when industry partners with higher ed and also partners with these training programs, we end up with industry endorsed curriculum. And so with industry endorsed curriculum, it eases the entry, it eases the pathway for those who are enrolling in the various different opportunities that are out there for training and education, and then again, eases their pathway into employment. So I would say that, from a certification perspective, I know that we have not necessarily with our program experienced any barriers for folks for employment. Our program has an 81% employment placement rate at this point. And we really haven't seen those barriers, but I think that, the more programs out there, the more collaboration and the more input from industry, so that we're making sure that the curriculum that we're developing is meeting the needs of industry. I think if we're doing that, then that's going to ease that pathway to employment, and as well as wealth creation, because this is another major area when it comes to equity in the industry.
Great, good points. Well, we're getting toward the end of our time. I want to thank all of our panelists for a great discussion. I want to thank everyone who is listening to this, and I'd like to turn it back to Dr. Rowe from Sanofi to close it out.
Thank you, Robert, for passing it back. Well, thank you, Rob, Kendall, Gretchen, and Jeff. What a thought-provoking conversation this was. We covered everything from opportunity, both from the perspective of business opportunity as well as educational opportunities at the end, vacancy rates, real estate, innovations, health disparities, the reputation of industry, cost of healthcare, and wrapped up with the really showcasing the intellectual powerhouse that the Massachusetts area is. So I have to say, very well done. I've never heard so many very different topics covered in such a short period of time with the panel in such an energetic way. So thank you so much. I think listening to this, I can certainly say Massachusetts is well positioned to lead. And speaking for my colleagues at Sanofi, we are certainly proud to be a member of this community. So a very sincere thank you to the Globe team for organizing this discussion. That you will join other conversations on Wednesday and Thursday. Enjoy your afternoon. Take care.